detention, not only in the U.S., but in
Europe as well.
Everyone is saying Italy. Yes, Italy, Europe. Now, in this particular conjuncture I'm referring to, at the same time, we saw the intensification of attacks by the Israeli state on the West Bank and Gaza. Now, I want to suggest that it is not accidental that young people began to speak out against white supremacy and racism precisely as Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism were becoming increasingly apparent. And as I have written elsewhere, the use of, I don't usually quote myself, but in this instance, the use of the war on terror as a broad designation of the project of 21st century Western democracy has served as a justification of anti-Muslim racism. It has further legitimized the Israeli occupation of Palestine. It has redefined the repression of immigrants. It has indirectly led to the militarization of local police departments throughout the United States. Police departments, including on college and university campuses, have acquired military surplus from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan through the Department of Defense excess property program. Thus, in response to the recent police killing of Michael Brown, demonstrators challenging racist police violence were confronted by police officers dressed in camouflage uniforms, armed with military weapons and driving armored vehicles. Thus, I think it is important to understand racism of the first decades of the 21st century without recognizing the articulation with the torture, military assaults, and ideological dimension of the so-called war on terror. One of the very first of the new youth organizations associated with the rise of radical anti-racist activism, the Dream Defenders, not only challenged the failure to achieve justice in the case of Trayvon Martin in Florida, they called upon young people of color throughout the state to unite in pursuit of a future free of racism everywhere. Not only has their leadership included, from the very outset, a young Palestinian-American attorney by the name of Ahmed Abu Naid, but justice for Palestine has been organically interwoven into all of their agendas against racism. In 2014, the year the Ferguson protests erupted, more Palestinians were killed by the state of Israel than in any other year since the occupation began in 1967. It was not fortuitous that Palestinian Americans became active in the Ferguson protests from the very outset. And as some of you may know, Palestinians on the ground in occupied Palestine were the very first to convey support and solidarity to the Ferguson protesters. And later, in early 2015, activists from Ferguson, the Dream Defenders, the Black Lives Matter organization, the Black Youth Project 100 participated in a solidarity delegation to Palestine and returned to urge activists against racism in the US to seriously take on solidarity with Palestine. And it is actually quite interesting that on university campuses throughout the country, Black student organizations that are intensely involved in struggles against racism on campuses have also articulated the issue of justice for Palestine with their local struggles. At historical conjunctures such as this, we embrace new possibilities we were once afraid to acknowledge. But at the same time, there are signs that we might move in a backwards direction. On the one hand, there appears to be in the US a new consensus against mass incarceration. And people everywhere, especially young people of color, especially young black people, especially young black women, and especially young black queer women, are taking the lead in struggles against racist state violence. Students in the US are demanding changes in the system of higher education as well. At the University of Missouri, students successfully called for the resignation of the president, who had refused to address a whole range of cases of racism on the campus. And if some of you followed that story, you know that they were able to get the support of large numbers of faculty. But when the football team supported them, the chancellor resigned. What is so interesting now is the fact that finally activists are recognizing the intersectional relations among the issues that are driving political activism. They're making connections between racism and heteropatriarchy, transphobia and anti-capitalism, Palestine and Ferguson. The Black Lives Matter movement, led by Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, that movement is forcing what can be called now a national conversation on race. Bill Clinton, some of you may remember him, he's still on the political scene today. But during his administration, he called for a conversation on race. But nothing really happened, despite the efforts of scholars, scholar activists like John Hope Franklin. Obama called for a conversation on race. But there were critiques that insisted that any attempt to engage with race or racism would be considered a particularistic concern of a black president. And so it has taken a movement against police violence, one that recognizes the links with over-incarceration in the prison industrial complex, one that emphasizes the deeply structural nature of racist state violence, one that acknowledges the kinship of struggles for racial justice in the US and of struggles for justice in Palestine. It has taken a consciousness of these affinities, all of these affinities, to spur on the beginnings of what we might now call a conversation on race. This emphasis on connections, on intersectionality, has largely come from feminist influences on current struggle. And of course, the feminism I speak about is also anti-capitalist. It recognizes the deep interconnections between anti-capitalism, anti-racism, and the struggle against gender violence and for gender equality. And so all of these these new movements, all of these new anti-racist movements acknowledge the importance of this anti-capitalist, anti-racist feminism. What is especially exciting about these movements is that, number one, they take seriously the importance of developing an analysis of capitalism and recognizing the connections with the attack on labor. It is quite interesting. It is quite interesting that in the 1970s, for example, when there were some 200,000 people behind bars, 1 out of every 3 workers in the US was a member of a labor union. And today, when we have almost 2.5 million people behind bars, 7 million under the direct control of the criminal justice system, only 1 in 10 workers is a member of a trade union. And these new movements see racism within, as I've been saying, an intersectional framework. And I might elaborate by saying that anti-Black racism requires an understanding of anti-Indigenous and anti-Latino and anti-Asian racisms, and especially now of anti-Muslim racisms and Islamophobia. But also of other forms of repression, anti-immigrant repression, misogyny, ableism, homophobia, transphobia. These new movements recognize that no movement for justice can be complete unless their internationalist context is acknowledged. Thus, the connections with the movement for justice in Palestine. In many ways, you might argue that Palestine plays the role in anti-racist movements today that South Africa played in the 1980s. And these anti-racist movements are developing new modes of leadership. In Black communities, we are accustomed to a kind of individualist, charismatic, male leadership. And thus, the new forms of leadership have not necessarily been acknowledged. They've not necessarily been recognized as leadership because they are collective and incarnative, and because much of the leadership is coming from women. There's Black leadership, there is women's leadership, there is Black queer women's leadership, there is Black trans leadership, not, and I emphasize this, not for identitarian reasons, but rather because this kind of collective leadership can help to extricate us from assimilationist frameworks and objectives. And finally, in characterizing these new anti-racist movements, I can say that movements are now recognizing the importance of incorporating routines of self-care into the very process of struggle.